And here, this is one where I'm, happy with a couple of answers. And I'm really unhappy with only two. And the two answers I'm unhappy with are A and C. It's not an armor-plated, reliable, and stable finding. And it's also not ignorable. It does tell you relatively little about what's going to happen next year. There's lots of noise and error in this relationship. I'm somewhat unhappy with B. It's uncertain. It's not too uncertain to be relied on. You just shouldn't rely on it too much. The answers I'm happy with are D and E. It does tell you a lot about what will happen if unemployment stays high or low for the next half decade or so. And it is indeed right now being tested. That is, the Phillips curve would tell us that we should be seeing deflation right now, and we aren't. So the relationship is revealing itself as one that breaks down in times of very high unemployment and very low inflation, and hence not to be relied on, even to the extent that D says you should rely on it over a half decade or so, when the economy gets deeply into trouble. So why does all this matter? Should we really care about inflation? That is, if wages and prices rise at about the same amount, why is it a problem at all? And why would anybody ever do what Paul Volcker did in 1982, which is to deliberately trigger a very nasty episode? Because he thinks inflation needs to be reduced. That our current high unemployment, it's not something that anyone in the government wanted to see happen. Right? It's a colossal mistake, produced by colossal mistakes of government policy, but nobody ever looked and said a good world will be one in which unemployment kisses 10% in the next several years. Back at the start of the 1980s, Paul Volcker and his peers on the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee did explicitly say, we want the unemployment rate to go up in order to purge inflationary expectations out of the economy, because we think having an economy in which the inflation rate is 4% or 3% or 2% is a very valuable thing, as opposed to an economy where the inflation rate is 10% or 15% or 20% per year. And we think that throwing a lot of Americans out of work for a long time is an acceptable price to pay for achieving this particular goal. And that's a question. Is it worth it? That after all, if everyone's wages rise and everyone's prices rise at the same rate, why is that a problem at all? If you have a situation in which inflation is stable at 10% per year, why not simply let that continue? Why bother to push the unemployment rate up to 10% and thus lose all the useful stuff they could be making just to shift inflationary expectations and get them down to 4%? Yeah? Yeah. In 15 years, yes. If you take a very long perspective, yes. It won't happen in 1 year, it won't happen in 5 years. But aside from that, it's a fair bet that if the overall price level in the economy doubles, the wage level is going to close to double as well. You can find some examples where it takes longer than 15 years to adjust, Europe in the 1980s being one of them, but such episodes are pretty rare. Usually inflation happens on both the wage and the price sides. One reason is to that inflation distorts what your view of the world is, unless you're very careful to take account of it, and nobody's that careful. Nobody's willing to spend as much time. So here's a question I don't expect you to know the answer to, but it's interesting to set up the next point. My favorite Star Trek movie is actually Star Trek 4, Star Trek at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. And let me see. People suspect that The Wrath of Khan grossed the most because it was the best movie, probably, which is a reasonable thing to do. And if you actually look at what the film's grossed, you'll see that the biggest one by far is the most recent, is the rebooting of Star Trek. But if you adjust the numbers for inflation, it actually didn't do any better than the original movie. And for some reason or other, completely unfairly, Star Trek The Wrath of Khan did not do nearly as well as either. So you make a bunch of decisions about anything having to do with finances in an environment of substantial or rising inflation, and you're going to be in trouble. Right? Your judgment is going to be off. But after all, a market economy works, this is back to micro, by people using prices to calculate what they ought to do, by calculating what things are valuable, and a market economy works well when prices reflect actual social values and scarcities. That is, when low-priced things are cheap and high-priced things are valuable, then we're going to make good economic decisions. But an ongoing process of inflation, it makes all these calculations difficult, and it makes them all quite error-ridden. That inflation deranges the price system. Inflation is also unjust. That John Maynard Keynes, writing just after World War I, was very clear on the fact that a market economy can only work to the extent that people think that what it produces is somewhat fair. That everyone agrees that there's a lot of luck and chance and a good deal of entrenched position and some unfairness in how much people make and how rich people are in a market economy. But people, by and large, think that hard work is rewarded and entrepreneurial activity is rewarded and being at the right place at the right time is rewarded. In times of inflation, that tends not to be so, or that tends to be so to a much lesser degree. That people who'd worked hard and played by the rules and saved up their money suddenly find after 5 years or so that their money is completely worthless as a result of the process of inflation. And we actually don't think that Lenin ever said that the best way to destroy the capitalist system was to debauch the currency. The closest he came was saying that the engine of the printing press in producing rubles the Soviet government can use in order to buy weapons is one of the most important arms in our struggle against the reactionaries, the fascists, and the capitalists. But Lenin might not have disapproved completely of the sentiment. Why? Because the sight of the arbitrary rearrangement of riches that happens in inflation strikes at confidence in the equity of the existing distribution of wealth. That a bunch of people who haven't been hardworking but simply clever, or who understand the inflation process before others do, are the people who wind up rich. And so Keynes says, all permanent relations between debtors and creditors, which form the ultimate foundation of capitalism, become so utterly disordered as to be almost meaningless, and the process of wealth getting degenerates into a gamble and a lottery, rather than a contest and tournament on the one hand, or the reward for hard work on the other. So John Maynard Keynes would have approved, as best we can say, of the Volcker disinflation. He would have said that this is a price worth paying if your 4 years of high unemployment produce a world in which people are confident that the inflation rate will be low, rather than the high inflation 1970s. But the big reason why governments act like the way that Volcker did, why governments are extremely concerned with keeping inflation low, is that inflation is very unpopular. That after all, it was Jimmy Carter's chief economist, Arthur Oken, who came up with the idea that the way to run against Gerald Ford was to talk about the misery index, the sum of inflation and unemployment, and say that the Ford administration was not competent at managing the economy because of how high the inflation rate is. And indeed, because turnabout is fair play, Ronald Reagan and his economic advisors did the same thing to Jimmy Carter 4 years later in 2000, when things were actually considerably worse. Right? That Ford is down here, Carter's up here. In Britain, you have a similar thing happening. That Labour Party leader James Callaghan is defeated a year or two before Jimmy Carter by the Conservatives, precisely because the inflation rate is above 10%, and everyone thinks this is a big no-no. By contrast, both Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher win re-election in the early 1980s, even though unemployment is considerably higher under them than it was under Carter and Callaghan, in large part because inflation is lower. And the sharp reductions in inflation lead the voters to vote with their feet for Reagan and Thatcher for their re-elections against Walter Mondale on the one hand, his vice presidential candidate Geraldine Ferraro just died earlier this week, and I think it was Michael Foot of the Labour Party on the other. These things made governments think that central banks ought to act to keep inflation low whenever they can, and also that governments would rather that central banks just do what has to be done and not talk to them too much. That they want low inflation, but they don't want to be on the hook for if ever it's necessary to hit the economy with a brick and produce a high unemployment recession in order to keep inflation low. So with that quick, let's see what you got out of that. That's a quick survey of all the reasons that inflation might be worth fighting. And I'm curious which of those I managed to persuade most convincingly. All right. Inflation destabilizes the price system. Well, this is not good. Let's try that again. Let's hope for the people in the next room. All right. I'll simply stop. Okay, I have no idea what people are actually answering, but inflation destabilizes the price system as a as a resource allocation mechanism. Is the economic reason not to rate inflation? B and C are political reasons. B and C and D are political reasons. E is interesting, right? Because E says that you really need to aim for something close to price stability. That you don't dare have any inflation or more than the teeniest smidgen of inflation in the system at all, because people will think that a government that tolerates 6% inflation will tolerate 8, a government that tolerates 4 will tolerate 6, and a government that tolerates 2% inflation will tolerate 4. I should point out that Ben Bernanke appears to be in the E camp, right? That given his reaction to proposals from people like me that he raise his inflation target from 2% to 3% over the long run, he seems to have a strong amount of E in his gut when he makes monetary policy. I was going to do a brief survey of the Federal Reserve System, the thing that actually makes decisions on monetary policy in the United States. I was going to say the Federal Reserve Board consists of a chairman who has a 4-year term, a vice chair who has a 4-year term, and not of 4 members, but of 5 members. 5 members of the Board of Governors. They comprise the Federal Reserve Board. There also are the 12 presidents of the regional Federal Reserve banks who sit as voting or non-voting members on the Federal Reserve's chief decision-making body, the Federal Open Market Committee. And I was going to say that the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board is the chairman of the Open Market Committee, but the vice president of the Open Market Committee isn't the vice chair of the board. The vice chair of the Open Market Committee is the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And I would say that the 7 members of the Federal Reserve Board are voting members of the Open Market Committee, and the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York is always a voting member of the Open Market Committee. But of the 11 other members, this is wrong too, this is 5. 5. Of the other 11 regional bank presidents, at any one point in time, only 4 of the other bank presidents will be voting members. The other 7 will be non-voting members. The president of the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, for example, who's about to be economist John Williams, who was economist and Berkeley professor Janet Yellen, gets to be a voting member of the FOMC only once every 3 years. How do you choose 4 from 11? Well, the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland and Chicago are special. Their presidents get to be voting members every other year, as opposed to once out of every 3. But I don't have detailed time to go into the Federal Reserve System and how it works today. So let me just say that they move by consensus, that they were very scarred by the inflationary episode of the 1970s, that they were further scarred by the depth of the recession of the 1982 Volcker disinflation, and they're definitely outside of their comfort zone right now and wondering what they should do. And say we'll pick up on Thursday.